If you're being like lied to consistently about what's really happening, and you hear like the other side of what's happening and that resonates more with you, ultimately I think that's a positive thing, right? Because if we don't know what's actually going on, we can't fix the problem. And you could argue that like a lot of the lies and deception is to keep people from fixing the problem by thinking the problems are all other things. But it is depressing to have to confront that disconnect between what you thought was going on and what's actually going on. But ultimately, you have to remember too that the reason so much effort and money is poured into deceiving us, it's because we have the power to change it.
We are being lied to by everyone. Our governments, big tech, intelligence agencies, the media, social media platforms, and every other source of information we once thought credible. This is the dire 2024 warning from Whitney Webb, a popular investigative journalist and writer who is relentless about exposing these lies. In a recent interview with Natalie Brunell, Whitney peels off the many masks of deception and gives a chilling warning. Things are about to get really, really crazy. According to the accomplished writer and journalist, the global elites know that more of their lies are being exposed. So, they will double their efforts and other resources used to keep the masses distracted and subjugated. During the conversation with Natalie, Whitney exposes a grand plot to take absolute control of all aspects of our daily lives through the internet. Whitney explains that the first phase of the plot, to get us heavily dependent on the internet, has succeeded with a considerable number of the global population. The next phase is to get the internet under control using artificial intelligence. She warns that by 2025, artificial intelligence will produce more than 90% of online content, shaping reality for the global population however it wishes. Whitney also makes a ground-shaking reveal about the cryptocurrency industry, specifically about FTX, US regulators, and a plot to make a central bank digital currency, which ironically will not be controlled by the central bank.
But ultimately, you have to remember too that the reason so much effort and money is poured into deceiving us, it's because we have the power to change it. And a lot of it just comes down to completely like non-violent things people can do, like divesting from certain companies. Specifically, lately I've been talking a lot about divesting from big tech as much as possible, just because of like where a lot of those big tech billionaires in the national security state they're completely fused with at this point are taking us. They're a lot of what they are trying to do is entirely predicated on us remaining dependent specifically on their technology, when there's a lot of open source alternatives and like other like tech companies or developers that could be supported to develop alternative infrastructure. Like we don't need their tools, and those tools can be made differently, as an example, right? So I know people sort of like can feel black pilled, I guess, when being confronted with this information. But ultimately, I think part of the reason things have gotten to the point they are now is that for so long, so many people didn't want to have to confront that disconnect between the reality we're told and what reality like actually is, like what's actually happening, just because, people have been so willing to like outsource stuff to the government or the private sector or whatever, and not really follow up on it and just assume it's working the way it should. That there are a lot of malfeasance and corruption has been allowed to entrench itself and grow, and that obviously has to be confronted at some point, or it will just keep growing until it completely takes over and destroys everything. And we obviously can't have that happen. So you have to identify the problem to fix the problem, and you have to realistically assess not just what the problem is, but what you can do about it. There's a lot of people, psychologists specifically, that work for, the public relations industry or propaganda arms of governments, for example, or intelligence agencies that have studied very closely how to manipulate human behavior with technology. And I think when you consider that like a lot of social media companies have their origins with intelligence, or if they didn't at the beginning, they certainly do now. And how they know that, the like news feeds on social media can be used to manipulate people's emotions, or manipulate how people perceive events and reality. They leverage that. And to think they don't leverage that, I think would be really naive. So as an example, one that's like sort of well-known and easy to find if you search for it online, is Facebook attempting to study how to manipulate people's emotions to make them feel like more negatively, like intentionally make them more depressed by bombarding them with like largely negative news on their news feed, right? And so, we can assume that they do that with all sorts of things and specific events. And when you consider the fact that we know now, and we've known for some time, quite frankly, that a lot of these companies, for example, selectively censor things, they're trying to cultivate the public's perception of events and reality and all sorts of different things. And so social media is a big tool for that. And then also, the whole like dopamine stuff with like in like attention span impacts that social media and like stuff like TikTok and all of that is having on people. It's not really talked about enough. And for those of us that lived a decent part of our lives without that stuff, it affects us differently than like little kids that are exposed to that from extremely young ages. And how does that affect the brain? How does it affect socialization when all of that is still like developing? I think a lot of that has had like mostly negative impacts, and a lot of it doesn't get talked about. It gets normalized. And, there's we could do probably a whole podcast just discussing like all the different impacts that has on people and the type of impact it's had on different generations. Another big problem though, that does come up a lot in my work is the role of like how that data produced by all of this is harvested by intelligence agencies and then fed into AI, tied up with like this blob of Silicon Valley national security stuff, because they really are fused. I mean, they're the private contractors for the intelligence agencies, and there's a lot of overlap at this point.
At the moment, quite a number of moves are being made to regulate social media platforms and presumably make them safer, especially for children. An example is the UK's Online Safety Act. According to Whitney, this and similar legislation that seeks to mandate linking verified IDs to social media platforms are shams carefully designed to disarm the population until every aspect of our lives can be easily monitored and surveilled. During the interview, Whitney makes another huge reveal about FTX, specifically how the exchange was and continues to be a huge industry plant.
So you may remember from the FTX scandal last year that there was like this weird bank in rural Washington that's like basically like broom closet size, like one branch bank that had like less than significantly less than like $10 million in deposits before it was bought by this entity called FBH Corp, which was basically the current chief compliance officer of Binance, Noah Perlman, plus Jean Chalopin, the chairman of Deltec, which is known for being a big bank for FTX, but is also one of the biggest banks for Tether, USDT, right? And these guys, and there were a couple other people there. There's another Deltec guy and another guy I can't quite remember, but they're the ones that bought Farmington from this other guy named Archie Chan. And I wrote about Archie Chan specifically in his history last year. But basically Farmington got, after it was bought by Chalopin and these guys, started to undergo this transition from being this rural community bank, one of the smallest banks in the country, to trying to become part of the Federal Reserve System, changing their name to Moonstone, trying to become the bank of the future, and being involved specifically in like the cryptocurrency space and also like in marijuana, legal marijuana, and like just a huge transformation was underway there. Noah Perlman, who I mentioned earlier, was like on the board of Moonstone. Also, Chalopin, obviously very involved, as was his son, Javier Chalopin, who was chief digital officer of Moonstone. And pretty much around the same time, very small, like a couple days difference, I think, Alameda Research poured like 11.5 million into this bank, which was like at the time twice what they were, the whole bank was worth. And then they swell in like less than a year from 10 million in deposits to like 84 million. And like 74 million of that was just from 4 accounts. And 50 million of that was one account tied to Sam Bankman-Fried that was titled FTX Digital Markets. So you have Sean Jalopin, Deltec, you have SBF and FTX, and Deltec and FTX are obviously connected. And they're basically trying to use this tiny bank for something. And based on just what is documentable, there's no way this bank should have been approved by the Fed. It should never have been made part of the Fed system. And the Federal Reserve System refuses to explain still how they approved it and why. And there's also the same sort of like no comment, nothing to see here, even though like, yes, local reporter, you bring up good points. They were irrelevant to us at the time or something, from like Washington financial regulators. FTX collapses and all this scrutiny obviously gets placed on this tiny bank, even from mainstream media and also from congressmen. Like, it was obviously like something was going on there, and it was very obvious to see. And then the Fed has since like issued like enforcement actions against Farmington and like forced it to close down. And so it doesn't exist anymore. Yeah. But they had big plans for it before FTX unraveled. And that's essentially what this piece is about. It's about the partnership they made right before all of the FTX started to go to crap and just like explode, and is basically around this company called Fluent Finance that had partnered with Moonstone, and Fluent Finance was specifically looking to, through partnering with Moonstone, spur mass adoption of a US dollar pig stablecoin called US Plus. That was basically marketing itself without saying it by name, but naming Tether basically like a trustworthy Tether. So why are Deltec and FTX very tied up with Tether, including well before FTX went under? Just like a very known relationship there. Why are they using this other entity that they're hiding behind essentially to get involved with this new dollar peg stablecoin?